one.
Hello, everybody. I'm very excited to be here having a conversation with one of my favorite people and one of my favorite teachers, Patrick McKeown. So Patrick and I met years ago when I was exploring this new and amazing breathing technique that was completely transformative to my life and changed how I thought about the breath and pranayama, and recognized I needed to go into a deep study of this and understand more about the physiology behind it. And so I ended up in Dublin and then Galway, studying with Patrick in April, which I just have to say is not the best time of year to go to Ireland, especially if you're from Seattle. It's like Seattle in
It's
February.
cold. Even in August mightn't be always the best time to come to Ireland. It's hard to know with Ireland. It's hit or miss.
So, but what I can say is I had a splendid week anyway. It was one of the most exciting weeks of education that I've ever spent. And I learned so much. I thought my brain was going to blow up, but in a good way. And I came home ready and charged to share what I had learned with others, and have made that my goal and purpose in life over the last several years. And I'm excited to bring Patrick back. He's come now twice to my studio and trained a variety of people, many yoga teachers who also got the Buteyko bug and wanted to learn more, and as well as other kinds of healthcare practitioners who are interested in learning Buteyko to be able to better serve their clients. So Patrick, welcome.
Yes, thank you, Robin. I think it's a great marriage, Buteyko and yoga. Buteyko primarily looking at the biochemistry of breathing, and yoga, in my opinion, is primarily looking at the biomechanics of breathing. And bringing the two together, it's a perfect fit, because all too often with Buteyko, we've kind of neglected the biomechanics a little bit.
It's true.
And with yoga, the emphasis on biomechanics, but biochemistry was neglected. You know, it's kind of strange that, yes?
Yes and no. I mean,
Okay.
What I've learned in my research is that the yogis understood the biochemistry. I mean, the ancient yogis, from the original text, if you go back to learning about their methodology, which is very similar to the methodology that Dr. Buteyko recommended, clearly they knew that they were manipulating their chemistry, whether they knew it in those terms and oxygen versus carbon dioxide, but they knew that by increasing their kumbhakas, their breath hold times, that they could achieve these altered states of consciousness and deep stillness and quiet within. And a lot of the biomechanics around the bandhas were all about controlling their baroreceptors and their chemoreceptors in order to sustain those breath holds for longer and longer periods of time. So, of course, I didn't understand any of that until I studied with you, and then started studying more, and then going back and reading the original text in Pranayama. It's clear to me.
It's amazing.
They understood biochemistry. However, that was not transmitted and translated and passed down through most of the yoga lineages. So we lost that component, and I'm hoping that me and you and this
community will invigorate it. Yeah. So a really experienced student of pranayama will tend inevitably to have a long breath hold time. That they will have, you would expect it that you could identify an experienced student because they've been practicing doing slow breathing, which in turn is reducing the chemosensitivity, or how sensitive the body is to carbon dioxide, that their breath hold time will increase. And this would have been the premise originally in yoga.
What the premise was originally in yoga, and then what's happening in contemporary modern yoga, very different things. I would say this as a longtime practitioner of pranayama, and my colleagues used to tease me because I was like the only person in our group who actually practiced pranayama. I took it very seriously because I had so many respiratory issues, and I believed that there was a nugget there for me that would help.
Which you found?
And I sought out teachers who were particularly attuned to pranayama and knew a lot about the breath. And I studied with one of those teachers who's considered to be most senior in pranayama. And what I learned was that the most important piece for me and for all people was to increase the length of their inhale and exhale.
Yes.
And I developed, very slow breathing where I could sustain an inhalation and exhalation for, 24 to 30 seconds. So I was breathing slowly, but now I look back and I realized I was breathing in very large volume, which I
Yes.
realized does not actually transform
Yes.
the biochemistry, because you're maintaining minute volume, the actual amount of quantity of air,
Yes.
right? It's just a
Yes.
different ratio.
Yeah.
And so that's where I was like, oh, we're slowing the breath, but in the process,
Yes.
we're increasing the volume. So we're not getting the benefit that
Yeah.
was originally intended, because we're
Yes.
not making the breath more subtle, we're making it more gross. And
Yes.
subtle
Yes.
was the direction in all the texts. It's about making the breath more and more subtle so that it's imperceptible. That is the teaching from the original text. And then now we have people who are competing for who can ujjayi the loudest and the longest. So we have people hyperventilating in their yoga classes.
Yes. 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 So, Robin, really what it's boiling down to is that you're, in a way, that yogis understood of the critical importance of carbon dioxide in combination with oxygen. So to talk about that for a little bit,
Yeah, sure.
you
Launch.
know, when we're talking about the chemosensitivity of the body, when we're talking about biochemistry, traditionally the biochemistry relates to the pressure of carbon dioxide in the blood, which in turn is determined by the carbon dioxide in the lungs, which in turn is determined by our breathing. So alveolar ventilation or alveolar CO2 will determine arterial CO2. Now, if the body has an overly strong sensitivity to the buildup of carbon dioxide, our breathing tends to be heavier. And we can measure chemosensitivity using breath hold time. So one with a low breath hold time will tend to have a stronger chemosensitivity to carbon dioxide. And as a result, they have harder breathing. And they won't be able to sustain a breath hold to the same length of time. So when you're talking about subtle, how do you think the yogis would have described this? Would you think that they would have had air hunger or not during the duration of the exercise?
So it's interesting. I did this deep dive into the Vedic teachings and looked at how they actually described the process of pranayama and how they determine the length of the various parts of the breath, which is actually quite comical. Things like how long it takes to circle the knee with your finger and then listen to the cowbells ringing 5 times and then blinking. I mean, really, it's like,
Yes,
it
yes.
doesn't make any sense to us now, but now we
Yeah,
have stopwatches on our cell phones, and so we can
of course.
measure in seconds. But so a lot of it was very subjective, like how long is the cowbell ringing for, and is it the same every time? But anyway, but in terms of measurement, it was very clear. All the texts say the same thing, which is the farther out you can feel your breath from, like your hand, like
Yes.
how many hand lengths
Yeah,
away
yeah,
from
yeah. This is amazing
your
stuff, by the way.
right, then
Yeah.
less pranayama.
Yes.
Less pranayama. So pranayama is when you can barely feel the breath with the hand closed. So that means the breath has to be very light and
Yes.
very subtle. If you're breathing hard, it's going to be felt farther
Yes.
away.
So they
And
were
that
talking about conservation of the breath.
conservation of prana, it all comes back to prana. I mean, I titled my book Restoring Prana, which was not what I was thinking about it originally. I was thinking like therapeutic pranayama or something like that. But as I studied deeper, and then with my background in yoga
Mm.
philosophy and Ayurveda and understanding something about the teachings around prana, I realized the reason why it's called pranayama, because it's about restraining, containing prana. It's about filling our vessel and making
Yes.
us more pranically vital and alive. And so that's really the intention of pranayama, which even though I practiced pranayama for almost 30 years before I met you, I never really experienced that. And then, I got sick and I was so depleted, and I became involved with
Yes.
Buteyko, and I started having this pranic experience. And I started having the experience that was described in the text in relationship to pranayama. Like the results of doing pranayama practice is this increase in energy and clarity of mind and needing less sleep and needing less food and a vibrancy and a sense of health and well-being. And like I'd experienced like some calming and kind of chilling out from my pranayama, or a little energizing, but it was temporary. It was like for the half hour afterwards, and then I was sort of back into normal mode. And what struck me so profoundly from literally the first 24 hours of practicing Buteyko is that I had this sustained quality of attentiveness and awareness and focus. And I've always been a highly focused person, but this is a different kind of focus.
Sure.
And the quiet, internal quiet that I felt, the settling, and just that sustained sense of deep stillness was unlike anything I had ever experienced. And it's sustained now for, what is it, going on 4 years. So I think it's working.
Yeah, for sure. And do you think that the yogis originally, that they would have taken into consideration everyday breathing? In other words, how should we breathe during sleep? How should we breathe during physical exercise? How should we breathe during stress? In other words, that breathing is not just how we should be breathing when we're during a practice, but we should be taking that information. Like I can imagine the number of people who might go into a yoga studio, and many are going to go in for stress-related conditions and to improve their health. And they're getting the benefits inside the yoga studio, but they're not carrying those benefits into their everyday life. What do you think? Do you think that we're missing something?
Well, I'll address that on two levels. For me personally, like my teachers always stressed nose breathing when practicing.
Excellent.
So I was a dedicated and committed nose breather whenever I was practicing yoga, whether I was in a class or practicing at home. But I was a consummate mouth breather every other minute of the day and night, snoring all night.
Yes.
You know, just not even realizing that my mouth was open and that I was a mouth breather, because nobody, my teacher had never said, and nose breathe when you're not on your mat, right? So that's one of my big calls, like when I'm teaching yoga teachers, it's like, this isn't just when you're practicing yoga. Like functional breathing, healthy breathing is through the nose 24/7. So that piece definitely has not been transmitted down. In terms of the teachings around how to breathe for different activities, remember I was talking about the different, you know, how far out. There's one of the texts that lists like when you're doing when you're in meditation, it's like this far away. When you're exercising, when you're eating, it's this far away. And sleeping is actually the farthest out. Exercise and sleeping is the farthest out. So they do recognize that people breathe more heavily at sleep, during sleep. There was that recognition, that knowledge that it does change, right? However, there's this other piece that I think has also been missed in the transmission down the lineages of yoga, which is what worked in the environment for the yogis back then because of the kind of life they were leading. When it comes, this is really about prana. It really is about the essence of prana. Like they were living in an environment where, of course, they ate only organic and local. There was no option, right? The water and the air and the soil itself was healthy. They had to be physically active to keep themselves warm, to keep themselves fed, to have water. And they weren't communicating much. They weren't like sitting around yakking. They weren't doing Zoom calls with people halfway across the world, right? Their life was much quieter, simpler.
Yes, they don't have competitive pressures, I don't think, and
exactly. Well,
the stresses, financial stresses, I couldn't imagine that they have the same as today.
Right. I mean, I'm sure they had stresses.
Yes.
Because they wrote about stress, so they understood stress. Right?
Yes.
I mean, the yoga teachings are essentially, they don't use the word stress, but dukkha refers to a state of stuckness that can manifest on multiple levels, whether it's mental or emotional or physical, right? There's a sense of not not knowing the way out of some kind of deep-seated pattern that you're stuck in, like a rut, and that this is the seed of all suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And the basic tenet of yoga. So if they didn't understand that, they couldn't have written so profoundly about it. At the same time, no, they weren't dealing with the kinds of things that we're dealing with in our life. And so what I appreciate so much about the insight that Dr. Buteyko brings is that he's more contemporary, dealing with people with chronic health issues in society today. I mean, even though it was some years ago, it still is much more contemporary than the yogis who were doing these practices. They were engaged in these practices, you know, basically 24/7. This was their life, the achievement of the state of samadhi, and that was the goal. Yes. Whereas Dr. Buteyko's looking at people who have critical health issues and asking the question, like, how can we help these people to live a happier, more functional life, right? And using breath as a major tool or medicine for healing. And so different question and a different use of that tool. And so I think it's more relevant in some ways to look at how he approached it, because it's more in keeping with what at least the people I work with as a yoga therapist need.
Yeah, Buteyko, one of his questions, probably which was profound, was he's seen sick people, they breathed hard. And he asked, was it their sickness which was causing the hard breathing, or was it the hard breathing which was causing sickness? Now, this also ties into a saying that I heard from yoga many, many years ago, and I'm sure many people have heard it, that man's life is not measured by the number of his years, but by the number of his breaths. Exactly. So we have a limited amount of breaths that we are taking. And if we look at the animal world, the animals that breathe fast, they have short lives. And the animals who breathe really slowly have long lives. And if we have a high breath hold time, we tend to have a reduced and low and slow respiratory rate. And this is very important in terms of that description that you gave me, that the hand from the face. If the objective is to breathe light, that we feel hardly any air, intuitively and instinctively, the practicer is going to feel air hunger. And we know that air hunger is one way to reduce the chemosensitivity that we're addressing the biochemistry. So exactly. I think this is really interesting that it's almost that it's coming full circle, that maybe air hunger wasn't written down, but the very practice of doing this would have generated air hunger, because if my aim is to slow down my breathing till I can't feel the air on my hand, I'm going to reduce my minute ventilation, which in turn is going to increase carbon dioxide in the blood, which in turn is going to reduce the chemosensitivity of the body to carbon dioxide, which leads to slower breathing. And nose breathing connected with the diaphragm and slow breathing is all interlinked. So it's really interesting what you said.
Yes, absolutely. And the pranayama ratios emphasized retention and suspension, hold after inhale and hold after exhale. And in reading the text, I mean, this is one of the later chapters in my book, is addressing this whole idea of kumbhaka and, you know, retention versus suspension, which they have different, obviously there's different chemical components to it.
Yes. Could we tease it out a little bit, just for people who are not coming from pranayama? So say you would inhale for a count, and then hold for a count, and then exhale for a count, and then hold for a count. What would it be like?
That there's 4 sides of the breath, and by manipulating those sides, I mean, this is the general teaching, is that each side has a different pranic quality.
Yes.
And so depending on the balance between inhale and hold after inhale, exhale and hold after exhale, excuse me, got a little tickle.
Sure.
That you can manipulate energy. You can manipulate prana. So inhale and hold after inhale have more of an energizing, we call it brahmana, but more energizing
Yes,
quality.
but you know, it's also going to allow more oxygen to diffuse from the lungs into the blood. So if you inhale slowly and then you hold your breath, there's sufficient time for oxygen to transfer from the lungs into the blood. So that is one purpose.
Exactly.
And then the exhale.
And then the exhale is more parasympathetic, right? So
Yes.
emphasis on the exhale, which is the most common orientation towards pranayama in the world of yoga, is to emphasize the exhale, which I also address that it's beneficial. Of course, if people are stressed out, having them slow their exhale is going to be an immediate calm and kind of bring them, off the limb of the tree that they're, they're hanging on. So that short term, I think, is useful. What's missing is this, what was their breath pattern before, and if they were a chronic hyperventilator and that's their primary mode of practicing pranayama, it's going to exacerbate the issue, which is what happened to me. And then hold after exhale is considered to be the most stilling and calming and quieting.
Which in turn is going to increase CO2 in the blood, which allows oxygen to be released more readily from the red blood cells to the cells.
Yes.
So it's amazing. And even the slow inhalation, it's allowing a pooling and a collecting of nitric oxide inside the nasal cavity, that if you're really breathing slowly, that NO is coming in from the nose into the lungs, which is helping to redistribute the blood throughout the lungs, which in turn is increasing the pressure of oxygen. It's coming back to some of this stuff, even though the yogis knew about it, like nitric oxide was only discovered in 1991. Researcher Swift found that when people were forced to nasal breathe post-jaw surgery, when their jaws were wired shut, the pressure of oxygen in the blood increased by 10%. Now, very few people realize that, and I was a mouth breather too for 20 years, and all the healthcare professionals, unfortunately, nobody ever said to me, Patrick, breathe through your nose, because I think most people think that breathing is just one of those things that's simple. Yeah, it's simple, but it's not so simple. So it's almost that the science is still just catching up, and even the functions of nitric oxide, even though it's been known in sleep, it's still not fully known exactly what it does. And I often think about breathing and the emotions and sleep all go together, because if you think of it this way, if we have a poor night's sleep, the mind is more likely to be agitated during the day. And if the mind is agitated, breathing is agitated. And if breathing is agitated, it affects our sleep. And, so one is feeding into the other. And also if the mind is agitated, it's like three different points to a triangle.
Absolutely.
That are all interconnected. Yes. And in terms of, and really that's where I think we're coming with. So I'm very excited to see this book, Restoring Prana, coming out. I've been telling everybody about it. I think it's tremendous. I think it's going to generate some awareness that sometimes I think there's such a myth out there. Bring in as much oxygen as you can and get rid of as much carbon dioxide as possible.
And that's, I actually, that's been my orientation towards teaching people, educating my colleagues and peers about this, is to look at the primary breath myths. That's one of them, and that CO2 takes up space that would otherwise be taken up by oxygen, and so we have to get rid of it all, and like all of those kinds of things. And then dispelling the myths. So I list them at the beginning, in my introduction, and then through the course of the book, of course, we look at each one in with a real microscope and examine it deeply.
Yes.
A lot of science and research, both from Vedic science and Western science behind it. And then at the end, I give this list of myth busters. A little elevator speech talk back when people say things like that. And every single one of the myths are things that I actually, true confessions, that I taught in my training programs, that I would pass on. The lineage of, there's this word in yoga, avidya. It means not knowing. And it's considered to be the seed of all of the dukkha, the suffering that we experience. Like underneath our suffering is because we really don't get what's really going on.
Yes.
And there's a variety of different ways that avidya takes shape, like our ego and, and our attachments and our aversions and our fear, all of these distort our ability to see what is. And so I totally come clean. In some ways, the book is a confessional of my deep avidya around the breath and my arrogance in believing that I knew, because I had studied with these incredible teachers who I have great respect for, but didn't realize that this avidya was being passed down.
Yes, well, Robin, I wouldn't call it arrogance, and I absolutely would admire you that you realize that there was probably more information to what you had been taught. How many occupations and how many professions and how many instructors are so closed to hearing new information? And this is probably that your own health condition was a blessing in disguise, because it forced you to look into different beings. Now, I remember when I was just reading a few snippets of your book that you quoted a lot the work of Italian cardiologist Luciano Bernardi. And he's looking very much at the cadence of breathing. So when you're talking about breathing in the book, you're not just talking about the biomechanics. It's not just enough to emphasize diaphragmatic movement. We also need to look at the biochemistry, which we've spoken about, the roles of carbon dioxide and the cadence. But really, it's bringing the three things together.
It's also the psycho-emotional. I actually have, I have the biochemistry section, the biomechanics section, and the psycho-emotional section.
Yes.
And in yoga, the breath is directly connected to the mind and the emotions. And in fact, all of the nostril technologies with, breathing through the left nostril or the right nostril and in various patterns, right? They're all specifically targeting different psycho-spiritual, right? Emotional factors, and directly related to the chakras and all the teaching around the chakras. And so, that I have a whole chapter on that, and a whole chapter on the vagus nerve and the psycho-emotional from the Western view, the connection between breath and mind, but then also the yoga view between breath and mind. I start there. I actually circle back around to that again, because it's not separate, right?
Yes.
In the yoga teaching, there's 5 dimensions to our manifest being, which is the physical, the energetic or pranic, so there's the physical body, or structural body, the pranic body or energy body. There's the mental body, the emotional or deeper character body, knowing body, and then there's the spiritual body. And in the teaching, it's not like they're 5 separate things. They're all interrelated. The word that's used to describe them is pancha, which means 5, maya, which means interpenetrating or pervading dimensions, maya koshas, which are the shis or dimensions of our being. So the idea is that, you can't, if you take a cell of the body, you're not going to say, okay, well, there's the emotional part over here, and here's the energetic part over here, and here's the mental part over here. It's all one. And so there's a constant informational, relay going on between these. So if I get freaked out about something, my body tenses, my breath accelerates the chest, right? And so the practices of yoga, if you think about it, are pretty brilliant, because it gives all these different doorways in to transformation, knowing that if you come in and you move your body differently, you're going to feel different. If you breathe your body differently, you're going to feel different. If you think your body differently, you're going to feel different.
Yes.
If right? And so any of these doorways in will transform all of it.
Yes, yeah. And I think it's amazing, because when you look at the dimensions that you spoke about, we can influence blood circulation by slowing down the breath with a slight air hunger, and the individual feels warmer. We can also increase oxygen delivery to the cells. We can decongest the nose using breath holding. We can also help open up the lower airways. We can increase blood flow to the brain. We can switch the body from a parasympathetic to a sympathetic to a parasympathetic. We can stimulate the baroreceptors. We can help restore normal autonomic functioning. We can increase respiratory sinus arrhythmia, heart rate variability. and vagus nerve traffic. Like, it's really amazing the power when you bring all of these dimensions of breathing together. But Robin, nobody is doing this. Why? Why have people just emphasized one dimension on breathing and forgot about other dimensions?
I don't know. I mean, my lineage goes back to Krishnamacharya, who's considered to be one of the greatest yoga masters in contemporary time. And he trained B.K.S. Iyengar and Pattabhi Jois and Indra Devi and his son T.K.V. Desikachar. All of these went on to really promote yoga in the West. Like many of the, not all, but many of the major schools of yoga have come from people who studied with him. And I posed this question to somebody who studied with Desikachar, Krishnamacharya's son, and she said, you know, what became apparent was that Westerners, it was so hard for them to breathe at all, that Krishnamacharya adapted and just said, let's just get these people breathing, right?
Yes.
Like they're not breathing. They're not breathing in a
yes.
functional way. Let's just get them breathing in a steady cadence, putting a little more emphasis on exhalation. They aren't even in a place where they can do breath holding.
Yeah.
You know, it was sort of like that.
So really about getting them out of their mind onto their breath. So the breath is a, you know, as a meditation, as mindfulness, and connecting with the body as well.
Yes, exactly. And so I think there's a couple of things. One is I think that was an idea, but then it didn't get developed to kind of circle back to take people into those deeper states. People are busy. They don't have a lot of time, right? There's all that.
Yes.
And you and I both know, and anybody who has actually done the practice of reduced breathing and breath holding, it's initially, especially if you're a big overbreather and have a high ventilatory rate,
yes.
it's not comfortable. It doesn't feel good initially for many people. It's like, oh my God, this is portion control. It's like going on a crash air diet, and there's a lot of discomfort. And if people have had trauma or they've had any kind of experience with drowning or suffocation, it triggers all that emotional stuff, anxiety, panic attacks. So it takes, I mean, and I don't want to scare anybody away. It's a process, and there's ways and means of calming the mind. And yoga, there's lots of great tools like using mantra and using mudra to help people through that initial transition to where they become more acclimated and they're able to relax into the lesser breath.
Yeah.
But I think that also becomes a barrier if people aren't fully trained in how to adapt and fine-tune the practice. Then it becomes very cumbersome. How do you teach a group of 40 students in a yoga class? And besides, making all that noise and those big breaths, it's really dramatic, right? And it feels like I'm doing something. See, I'm really practicing yoga, right? And you inflate the lungs and you see and you puff up your chest, and it's like, you know, it's a dynamic experience. And people go, see, I have this experience where we're not trained, unfortunately, to appreciate the subtle. But yoga across the board is all about becoming more and more subtle. It's about needing less from out there, or being pulled less into the out there, and being more and more at home and comfortable
with ourselves
and the silence of our own essence.
Yes.
That is a meditation. And it's very, very clear that the yogis, the way that they listed the 8 limbs, going from how we interact with people to how we live in our bodies, to how we breathe, to how we relate to our senses, to this deeper states of focus and meditation, and ultimately samadhi, enlightenment, that we have to get quiet. We have to get still. We have to be less engaged out there in order to achieve those deeper states of consciousness. And unfortunately, I do feel like somewhere along the line, we started turning the wheel in the other way and making yoga about this, look what I'm wearing, and look at the pose that I can put myself in. And none of that was ever, about yoga about. It's very understated. It's very undramatic. There's no drama.
Yeah, and no ego. I think it was interesting what you said, that initially when people do the reduced breathing, when you do reduced breathing volume, you do generate air hunger. And the air hunger for some people will be a little bit challenging, but we can always change that, and we can always kind of tailor it. And that's one of the beauties, that we can measure the response of the individual to some degree by using the control pause, but we can also assess them. And if the air hunger is getting a little bit too much, we can ease off on it. So I think it's about giving people a teaspoon. I think from a psychological perspective, there's a great thing about giving a teaspoon of air hunger, because you mentioned people who've had drowning experiences during childhood, or people with panic attacks, and you will have seen many, many of those. And we see them as well. Giving them a little teaspoon of the air hunger is really good for deconditioning them towards that fear of suffocation. Some of them have an overly strong fear of suffocation, and we can change that. And coming back to, I'm really interested in how you're tying this in with yoga. So say, for instance, if a yoga instructor is watching and they're doing a particular set of postures and they're bringing their students through it, and typically, if they were taking, say, encouraging big breaths, can you easily integrate changing breathing patterns so that you can bring breathing from both a biochemistry, biomechanical, and also cadence into an existing yoga structure?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've spent the last several years developing ways of doing that, and fortunately, my client population is very open and willing to go.
So they were your guinea pigs.
They were willing guinea pigs. Both my training students, who are experienced yoga teachers, who are training to become yoga therapists, so they were willing, and they could offer one set of feedback. And then I've got my therapeutic clients who have chronic pain issues and a variety, and some anxiety, depression, and chronic inflammation, a lot of autoimmune conditions that I work with. So they could give me other feedback, and I could see sort of what worked in one population and one worked with the other.
Yes.
There's a process, and I do go through. I have a set of appendices that are specifically oriented towards yoga teachers, and I'm in the process of developing a certification program for yoga teachers to teach pranayama as a template. I've got the practices from the book, so each chapter in the book has a set of practices that build throughout, and I created a workbook that will be out next summer.
Great.
That's specifically just the practices, and where people can actually write their answers in, and there's charts, and so they can chart their comfortable pause and their breathing and experience different techniques that I suggest, that with the mudras and mantras and all different things. So they can have their workbook there, and that will be a manual for this certification program. So I can't give all that right now, because first of all, it's
of course.
But the first thing is, teaching people, giving some people some ideas about how to get their breath quieter and more internal, and teaching that. And the abdominal diaphragmatic piece, the biomechanical piece, is bigger, I think, than most people realize. So one of the many surprises that happened to me when I was doing research for this book is that I had this experience of love. I fell in love with the diaphragm, like really and truly, I was so blown away when I started studying what
does it do?
The diaphragm conducts with its movement, with the heart literally right on, connected, fascially connected. There's no separation between the diaphragm and the pericardium around the heart. It's one piece of fabric. So here you've got the diaphragm moving like this, and it's literally massaging the heart. And then you've got all of the visceral organs underneath. You've got the vagus nerve coming through, the vena cava, the aorta, like the lymph system. Everything right there depends on this movement
of the diaphragm.
Movement of the diaphragm.
Yes.
And if the diaphragm isn't moving much. In order, let me say this, in order for the diaphragm to move well, we have to be breathing biomechanically in a functional way, which means abdominal diaphragmatic breathing, because the abdominals work synergistically with the diaphragm. When the abdominals contract, the diaphragm is relaxed and it pulls the in. And when the diaphragm contracts and moves out, the abdominals relax. And so they work in tandem together to get that nice visceral pump for every organ, and that means every system of the body.
And even intra-abdominal pressure, lower back pain as well.
Exactly. And so because the diaphragm is a primary stabilizer.
Yeah.
It's part of the inner core, working with the transverse abdominis and the pelvic floor muscles and the multifidi. And so they all work together if they work well together. And so I looked at a lot of the biomechanical studies looking at functional movement and functional breathing.
Yes.
And there's a correlation. People who chest breathe, which means they're not abdominal diaphragmatic breathing, they also are much more vulnerable to back pain, neck pain, right? SI issues, dysfunctional issues in their pelvis. So there's this correlation there too. So the biomechanics go hand in hand with, and of course that pumping also, there's the vagal response. So that's also keeping the nervous system in a nice equilibrium. So there's it's not one or the other, it's and both.
And also the diaphragm also seems to be connected with the emotions. If you look at the work of Bordoni, it really. And the other question is, people often talk about diaphragmatic breathing. Physiotherapists, physical therapists, speech language pathologists, many disciplines talk about diaphragmatic breathing, but I think they sometimes fail to consider the importance of nose breathing. Do you think you can adequately achieve diaphragmatic breathing if you continue breathing through an open mouth?
No, there's a direct correlation between nose breathing and diaphragmatic breathing.
Yes.
You can breathe diaphragmatically through your mouth, but it's not as impactful or effective.
Yes. And you'd have to consciously think of it.
Well, and until it's programmed, right?
Yeah.
And there's 2 whole chapters looking at the engagement of the abdominals and the pelvic floor muscles, the core muscles in tandem with the breath to create synchronization. And it does have to be consciously created. If somebody is a chronic chest breather, it's not enough to say, stop doing that.
Yeah.
Right? Like take the breath down. You actually have to recruit and condition the abdominal muscles to sync with the diaphragm, with the breath. And there's studies that show that the best pelvic floor muscle practice or exercise is abdominal diaphragmatic breathing in synchronicity, like exhale, come bringing in. So if the diaphragm and abdominals are working well together, the pelvic floor will automatically sync with the diaphragm and work in an efficient and effective way. Whereas if you're not breathing well, functionally, abdominal diaphragmatically, not only does it create tension in the neck and shoulders, but it also creates dysfunction in the pelvic floor. So they go together, and that goes with mouth breathing as well.
Yeah, and I suppose breathing is going to trump everything. Like respiration. If breathing is dysfunctional, I've seen it that other systems can be made secondary to assist with breathing.
Exactly.
Because ultimately it's breathing which is paramount in the sustenance of life.
Exactly.
I think sleep also is getting a lot of attention at the moment, and breathing is going to play a huge role in terms of sleep medicine, in terms of either people who are snoring or people with obstructive sleep apnea, people with upper airway resistance syndrome. And it's relatively common in the United States and Western countries, throughout the world. I'll just give you some statistics. It affects 9% of females and 26% of men aged between 30 and 49. But when females hit 50, it triples to 27%. And with males, it increases to 43%. And poor sleep quality plays a huge role in terms of the generation of diseases, including, say, for example, diabetes, but also dementia is linked with sleep problems. Now, breathing, have you seen it in your students that when you get them breathing through their noses that you see a difference in their sleep?
Absolutely. I mean, I experienced it myself, but definitely my students and my clients, that's often the first thing that they come back with, is that they're sleeping better. Now, I have to say this, that has been consistently true. Even when I taught the old way of teaching pranayama with more focus on slowing the breath down and increasing exhalation, that already helped people get to sleep and relax, right? All of those pranayama techniques that are the direction of calming the nervous system and creating more of a parasympathetic vagal tone, right? Are going to help people with sleep and helping people to let go of whatever's going on in their mind, right? And so they're relaxing their mind, which enables sleep. But I think the difference for me is it's the quality of sleep that is the biggest change
with nose breathing.
There's a
during
deeper
sleep,
less getting up and having to pee, less night waking, and more of a sense of feeling refreshed and rested. Not just going to sleep more easily, but also staying asleep, sleeping deeper, and with more effective sleep.
Yeah, because people with breathing pattern disorders, if we breathe fast and hard, we generally will tend to breathe through an open mouth. Now, you can imagine as well the cohort of people going to yoga studios, people over 40 years of age, we are 6 times more likely to spend at least 50% of our sleep time breathing through an open mouth. And I often use the example, if you wake up with a dry mouth in the morning, you're not getting really full restorative sleep. And I think that was interesting what you said with the emotions, that you've been traditionally using pranayama and activating the parasympathetic response in order to ensure that people do go to sleep. Because I think any of us who've had a stressful day, it's difficult to switch off. And if the mind is agitated that night, we're more likely to be twisting and turning. And we generally have good coping skills, and I would consider myself to have relatively calm temperament. It would take quite a bit to push me, into stress, but my sleep can be affected. Now, how about somebody who's got agitation of the mind 24/7, people who are prone to anxiety, and they really will have a hard time switching off, and that's impacting their sleep. And I think that's a group of people, if you look at the people who are prone to breathing pattern disorders, it's 9.5% of the normal population, 30% of the asthma population, according to the literature, but we would say it's a lot more. But 80% of people with anxiety have breathing pattern disorders. Now, I remember giving a talk to psychotherapists, and I was talking about the wonderful work of cognitive behavioral therapy, because it really works. But in terms of addressing the big picture, the elephant in the room, in my opinion, is the breathing of the people with anxiety and their sleep. And this would be very interesting in terms of yoga, is incorporating slow breathing with air hunger, changing the biochemistry, changing the cadence, and restoring nasal breathing for the individuals who are seeking out yoga for stress, for anxiety, and for depression.
Yes, absolutely. And a lot of the people that I see as a yoga therapist are people with anxiety and depression, right? They're in chronic pain. So it's hard to know which came first, right? Sometimes they lead with their structural issues or their physiologic health issues. And sometimes they're leading, they're coming because of the anxiety or depression, because yoga is known to have impact on all of those. So regardless, I always am teaching them functional breathing, which means a softer, reduced, more gentle cadence, and taking them in the direction of reduced breathing. And then, oftentimes introducing things like short breath holds to get them having that experience, which I think is like the most brilliant thing in the world. Really and truly, like how I lived my life without short breath holds, I do not know. But I think that it's the other piece that yoga brings to the conversation is that if people are stressed all day, their body is in a state of contraction. And this in and of itself is going to affect the breath and the mind. And so like one of the assignments for my yoga therapy students when they are in the program is they have to develop a pocket insomnia practice that they can pull out anytime for anybody, because it's such a pervasive theme.
Yes.
The idea with yoga therapy is that we're customizing for an individual. So it's not that they're going to give that generic plan, but I want them to think through what would be the kinds of movements and a physical sequence, the breathing practice, the mental practice, how to incorporate lifestyle, sleep hygiene, because that's a big piece. What do they do? Are they on their phones and their computers watching the news and all these things? Are they eating late? Like really looking at it as a whole picture to get people sleeping, back into a good sleep rhythm, because nobody can heal without sleep. That's the bottom line.
I would agree. And there was a really interesting paper published in 2018 looking at light sleepers. It was looking at individuals with obstructive sleep apnea and which group of people had the greatest risk of mortality. There were individuals with low arousal thresholds that came out the greatest risk of mortality, light sleepers. And I was kind of shocked because I was expecting it was the man who was stopping breathing for a minute and a half. He was at the greatest risk, but no, it wasn't him. It was the people with mild to moderate sleep apnea. Because, and this is coming back to your point, can people really get better health-wise if their sleep is sacrificed? And oftentimes you'll see people coming in with depression and anxiety, and they also come in and they're exhausted. And all too often, I think the healthcare professional is thinking that it's the depression and the anxiety which is causing their exhaustion. But maybe we should be asking the question, is it poor sleep quality which is causing exhaustion? And is it the exhaustion which is increasing anxiety? And is it the anxiety which is prolonged over a period of time leading to depression? Like today's modern society is a little bit crazy. It's go, 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 go. And we're expected to be able to function to the height of our abilities. We cannot function if we don't have good breathing, and we can't function if we don't have good sleep. And if we can't function, then of course mental health is going to be affected by it.
Absolutely. And along with that, people are spending, most of their life sitting. They're sitting at computers, they're sitting in their cars for long commutes, and they come home and they sit and they watch TV, and they're not exercising. They're not moving. I mean, I don't even want to say exercise, because exercise is like go to the gym, and which I love and I do. But it's also just moving to live. Like we used to move to live. And I always go back. What were these bodies designed for? They were designed to walk, was the number one thing that they were designed for. And they were designed to lift and haul and dig and maneuver. Yeah,
of course.
Right?
Yeah.
And harvest. And
that's
what we were designed to do. We were not designed to sit like this all day.
Yeah.
Right. And there's an impact, and that impacts our psychophysiology.
Yeah, of course.
And when it comes to this whole breathing piece, if people aren't moving, what's happening to their CO2 levels?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
The more we move, the more CO2 we have. So if people are in pain, or they're sick, or they're tired all the time, they're going to be more lethargic. They're going to feel less like moving, and the less they move, the harder they breathe. The harder they breathe, the less they'll sleep, and it just goes on and on from there too.
So what I think,
carbs, right, to give them a boost of energy, and that accelerates their breathing and also affects, like their weight and their mental capacity.
Yeah, of course.
Like so, it's got to be looked at as a holistic thing. It's not any one piece.
Yeah. So what I think you're saying is that people who really need to do physical exercise, they won't do it because they feel too breathless doing it. It's too exhausting for them. So what you could be doing is teaching them reduced breathing to increase their blood circulation, to increase oxygen delivery, to reduce the chemosensitivity of the body to carbon dioxide, which in turn is increasing their breath hold time. And breath hold time is a measurement of breathlessness. So with a higher breath hold time, you can do exercise easier, and exercise is more enjoyable. So I would say that people will do something if they enjoy it more. The pain perception could be also another one that's interesting in terms of the connection with the diaphragm, that if we have pain reduces when we breathe in and hold our breath. So an inspiratory apnea reduces pain. But I also remember reading a paper by James Bartley, who's an ENT, about temporomandibular joint disorder. And he was talking about increased muscle fatigue and lactic acid because of reduced oxygen getting to the cells, which in turn, the hydrogen ion coming from the cells doesn't get oxidized to form water, so it forms lactic acid. So it's really what you've been talking about is it's a vicious circle, that everything is connected, coming back in on itself.
Absolutely. And I think, again, going back to the brilliance of the yogis, which, you know, the more I learn, the more in awe I am of their capacity to put all these pieces together.
Sure. They were scientists.
They were absolutely scientists. And we, as yoga teachers and therapists, need to take on that as part of our lineage. We have to be scientists and be willing to investigate and not just take things as a given, right? Like, oh, okay, my teacher said, but really do the investigative work and learn more and grow and constantly evolve and educate ourselves. At least that's my bias. But I just want to say that asana and pranayama were put together, right? You do this conscious movement with breathing intentionally. So this goes back to your question about how do yoga teachers take this into their teaching class, right? So when I started working with my students and bringing this in, we started with just getting them breathing, being more aware of abdominal diaphragmatic breathing, you know, breathing less.
So you're targeting the biomechanics, the biochemistry.
Then let's start with simple, small movements that aren't particularly taxing and keep the breath settled. And if it starts to get excited, pause, be willing to pause, wait for the breath to settle, and then begin moving again. And then gradually increasing into bigger movements, movements that would tend to accelerate the breath more. Can you keep the breath light and silent?
So you're maintaining subtle breathing.
Be willing to settle the breath. And progressively, I mean, I have to say, my therapeutic students, and these are people who can't take a regular yoga class because they have some kind of limitations. But I got to tell you, they are all awesome breathers. And they're feeling better, and they like coming to the class because they feel the energetics of the experience as well as the physical benefits. Targeting their low back or their neck and shoulder pain or whatever is going on, their logical issues, but they also feel the energetics of how the breathing has also made a huge difference in their experience of the yoga practice.
And I think
process
for transformation of health, the people who are coming in with the three main things that we can impact. Can you imagine if yoga instructors throughout the world, and this is not a criticism of yoga, I'm not a yoga person, so I'm looking from the outside in.
You're such a yogi, Patrick. You're like the most yogi I've ever met. Honestly, I say that with such reverence and gratitude.
But to bring in a breathing technique that is encompassing all dimensions, that can be incorporated seamlessly into postures, because I've seen you work, so I understand what you were doing. And I could see that people could embrace them easily, not just for the people who are sick, but for the people who are healthy, to be transformative in terms of the power of influencing blood circulation, increasing oxygen delivery, the people with asthma, the people with sleep problems. So Robin, there is something that could be massive here. Like, we've been working with thousands of people and there's only a few of us. if this was embraced by the yoga community, and considering that this is, a lot of it has originated originally from yoga. Dr. Buteyko, if you look at the older textbooks from the Buteyko method, a lot of his work did come originally from Eastern medicine and from the Eastern yogi. So he was a medical doctor, so he was able to understand and put the science and his medical training to what the yogis had understood for a long time. It's literally transformative. And I will also say that I am often a little bit sometimes discouraged that when one might go to a yoga studio, and if the students are deliberately told to be taking deep, full, big breaths in the belief that it's going to increase oxygen delivery to the tissues. Yeah. Because if we look at the science of that, it doesn't happen that way. You know, if we take full, big, deep breaths, you know, if we increase minute ventilation, if we increase the volume of air beyond what it should be or beyond what we normally do, we get rid of too much carbon dioxide, and red blood cells actually hold on to oxygen instead of releasing it. So by doing what you're doing, by having subtle breathing and soft, slow, light breathing, while also maintaining the biomechanics, you're increasing oxygen delivery to the cells. This is where it's going to transform health. And if this was embraced by the yoga community worldwide, this is going to create a revolution, because there's only a few of us, but there's thousands of you.
No, there's millions.
There's millions.
I think in the United States, there's something like over 20 million people practicing yoga.
Wow. Well, it will absolutely transform it. And I would say to anybody who's teaching breathing, learn just a little bit about the basic physiology. Look at the Bohr effect. We should talk about Bohr actually for a moment.
Okay, let's.
So Christian Bohr, he was a biochemist from Denmark. And in 1904, he wrote that the partial pressure of carbon dioxide plays an important role in human physiology, that when there's an increase of carbon dioxide in the blood pH drops, and the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen reduces. In other words, your hemoglobin is the main carrier of oxygen in the blood, and 98% of oxygen is carried in the blood by hemoglobin. But a catalyst for the release of oxygen from the hemoglobin to the cells is carbon dioxide. And ultimately, you could nearly call carbon dioxide prana. I don't want to kind of...
Yes, I'm with you totally. I totally think that's the truth.
So by conserving the breath, you're conserving carbon dioxide, and carbon dioxide is increasing a little bit, accumulating in the blood, and the body is very sensitive to carbon dioxide, because the primary stimulus to breathe is carbon dioxide, not oxygen. And, you know, we have to bear in mind that hard breathing is getting rid of CO2. And if we were to believe that this hard breathing is increasing body oxygenation, well, the truth of the matter is that it's actually doing the opposite. And I'll give you an example I was doing an exam at a university in Dublin, and I was highly anxious before this exam, because of course, as a mouth breather and poor sleep, I had dreadful concentration. So I went around, this is no exaggeration, Robin, because I thought breathing big was good. 5 minutes before the exam, I went for a walk, and I literally took these big breaths, really hard breaths, because I thought I'm flooding my brain with oxygen. And I went into the exam hall dizzy. And little did I realize that the big breaths was getting rid of so much CO2 from the blood that my blood vessels to the brain were constricting. So I went into the exam hall lightheaded, when my aim should have been to have good concentration. I can imagine that a lot of people in the Western world, with the belief that it's good to take big breaths, are ironically breathing hard to bring in more oxygen to the cells when the opposite is happening.
Exactly. And I know that that you do a lot of work also with professional athletes.
Yes.
And training them using the same technique, not for
yes.
health, but to increase their aerobic capacity and their
yes.
performance time.
Yes.
So it works on that end as well.
Yes.
And I have a funny story like yours. I took my daughter to the spa for a weekend down in California, and there were all these exercise classes, and we both love to work out, and she, she knows my deal. So when she's in class with me, her lips are sealed.
Sure.
We had this instructor who was like your nightmare bad PE teacher. She's up
Sure.
there, all right, ladies, pick up your knees, move your arms, go faster, harder. And she kept yelling at us to open our mouths. Open your mouth to increase your oxygenation. Open your mouth. And I look at my daughter and I said, don't you dare. And she said, I wouldn't even think of it. Right. And so we're back there, lips sealed, doing the whole class, which is high intensity aerobic workout.
Yeah.
And she's really, the teacher's just like, like hairy eyeball at me, open your mouth. And I just finally looked at her and went,
yeah.
After class, we go out into like the cafeteria area, and there's a whole cluster of women around this one woman who all came out from our class. And this one woman who's like, oh, I'm like seeing stars. And I'm like, I don't know what happened. And I said, well, here's what you do. And I had her do some short breath holds.
Sure. Yes.
Right. And she was like, oh my God, that's so much better. Why did that help? And I said, well, you were hyperventilating. And so I give her a little, and I give her a little explanation. And then I hear from behind me, so when are you teaching? And I turn around and the rest of the class is listening in. And they're like, well, how come she's yelling at us to open our mouths?
Yeah.
I'm on vacation. I do teach, but I'm not teaching. And I don't know, but just know for yourself, keep your mouth closed when you exercise. Yeah,
totally. And the science has not, this is where what we've been saying for years, and we see the clinical experience of it, the science is only starting to catch up. There was one paper by an American academic, George Dallam, Dallam, and he's a triathlete as well. So he's been nasal breathing during his sports for a number of years, and he was getting the benefits of it. So he trained 10 recreational athletes, and he instructed them, all of their physical exercise was only to be done through their nose. And then he tested them nose breathing versus mouth breathing. After 6 months, when the body had made adaptations, the CO2 in the blood was higher, 44 millimeters of mercury pressure versus 40 with mouth breathing. But they didn't feel the air hunger. The air hunger had diminished because their body adjusted to it. But these individuals, they were able to attain 100% of their work rate intensity with 22% less ventilation by breathing through the nose. Now, this is why I was writing an article for Men's Health in England. It's a magazine for kind of fitness. And I was talking about the stupidity of mouth breathing during physical exercise. If you were told that mouth breathing is going to reduce oxygen uptake in the blood, mouth breathing is going to reduce oxygen delivery to the cells, you wouldn't do it. But that's really what happens. So with nasal breathing, you're able to increase oxygen uptake and increase oxygen delivery to the working muscles. So, the benefits far outweigh, but I can understand why people switch to mouth breathing, because the air hunger while breathing through the nose can be a little bit taxing. But this is where we need to kind of say, okay, I'm going to stick with nose breathing and let the nose dictate the intensity of my physical exercise, and then it becomes a habit.
And for me, it was a huge shift.
Yes.
I tell the story because I live on a hill. You've been to my place.
I know it. Yeah.
You either go down the steep hill and back up, or you go up the steep hill and come back down. But there's no flat if you walk out the door. So I've been walking this hill for over 25 years and not even thinking about it, and I'm used to it, and it was fine. And then I learned Buteyko breathing, and my original teacher.
Yes,
right. She's teaching me to take it into exercise and movement. And so I take off. I'm like, okay, fine. I've been doing great. My CP's up and I'm good. So I take off and I go up my hill, and I got with my mouth closed.
Yes.
I got barely like 300 yards up the hill, and I'm gasping.
Sure.
Literally doubled over, going like heaving, going, oh my God. I had no idea. It took me 2 weeks of walking slowly, really slowly. Sometimes I felt like I was walking backwards. I was walking so slow. Stopping if I started to feel like I was going to move into gasp, keeping my mouth closed. And then I, like literally within 10 days, 2 weeks, something like that, I take off out my door, head up the hill. I walk faster.
Yes.
With a feeling of lightness in my body that I've never experienced.
Yeah, yeah.
My mouth is closed the entire time. I get up to the top of the hill, come back down, and I'm like, who the heck are you?
Yeah.
And I have been in exercise my husband calls me a gym rat now, because I'm at the gym. I want to exercise all the time. And I never wanted to exercise before. I didn't even realize how much my lack of breath capacity was holding me back.
Yeah.
And now I love it. And I'm on the elliptical, and I increase the incline and the resistance, and I stay longer, and I do all my exercise
with the mouth closed.
Everything with my mouth closed.
Yeah.
And I'm healthier, have more endurance, stronger. I mean, I'll never probably, be an athlete, like run a race, but for me,
but it's not about that. It's about energy. It's about quality of life, really.
Exactly. It's increased my quality of life because I can now actually exercise. And I realized, and it got me thinking, and I actually put this in the book. It's a little bit provocative, so those of you who are listening, you can plug your ears if you don't want to hear this. But I'm thinking that many people like myself who were not conditioned in good condition and never felt like we could do sports or exercise, were drawn to yoga because it was a way of moving that didn't tax us.
I would totally agree with that.
Cardio aerobic way.
Yeah. And yet you get benefits, definitely.
Right. However, if we do yoga in the tradition of pranayama, the way it was supposed to be done, and weave that into our asana, we can move very vigorously, strongly, bigly, right? And keep our breath low and actually get similar benefits.
Yeah. Yes.
On the aerobic level.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, what we're doing now is what you described. We're having people do this big breathing in asana class. So they're diminishing their oxygenation and not getting the full benefit of yoga that was intended.
Yeah. I think it's coming. I think it's a nice way to kind of bring it full circle, and probably to draw our conversation to a close. But the power of this is going to be enormous. The power of your book is putting information out there, which I would encourage anybody who is working in any way with the breath to read. I have had an insight into the book. I know some of the content. I think the information is absolutely invaluable. It may open your eyes. Some of the information might be a little bit different to what you've believed. But I think if anybody really wants to improve their knowledge and the application of simple breathing techniques and incorporate it into their way of work, I would highly recommend reading Restoring Prana. It's going to be transformative, but what's more, it's going to be transformative for a population who is ever more reliant on pharmaceutical intervention and not living a quality of life that they should be living, that people can be going to yoga classes and get the benefits, but a transformative impact in terms of the changes to breathing, in terms of body oxygenation, blood flow, stimulating bioreceptors, restoration of the normal autonomic nervous system, or restoration of the autonomic nervous system. The potential here is enormous, Robin. And I don't think we've fully realized it. So it's going to be a very interesting journey next year when the book comes out. And the impact could be profound.
Well, I just want to thank you, Patrick, because a lot of the reason why I'm able to do the book is because of the education I received from you and the support and encouragement that I've received from you. So I really appreciate you in my life on multiple levels.
Oh, I'm happy to be a small part of it. So it's been great. And also to your original Buteyko instructor, and Pippa is tremendous, and she's still pushing it out there.
She is 85, right?
Wow. Yeah.
Awesome. Still doing the BBA newsletter, and
yeah, she's great. So here's to this, and we look forward to your book coming out. So when is it due out, and how can people buy it?
It's due out December 19th. You can buy it now, like this minute, right? You can go to Amazon and pre-order it. It's available, and I also want to, and I'll be teaching Restoring Prana in a workshop in San Francisco, December 1st, and I'll be in Orlando for 2 days teaching a 2-day workshop on Restoring Prana, in addition to my essential low back training for teachers in Orlando's January 20th through the 26th. So check that out on my website, eyt.yoga. And then Patrick, you're going to be in my home.
Yes.
In home studio training teachers
In
and others
February, isn't it?
To learn the Buteyko breathing and become
Yes.
certified. And and I just, anybody who's interested in that, please get in touch with me as soon as possible. And if you haven't done the Buteyko breathing process yourself, we can do Skype sessions with you beforehand so that you can have that personal experience. And I really encourage yoga teachers to step in and become educated and informed about respiratory physiology. It's the foundation for pranayama. And if we're teaching pranayama without that, we're really the blind leading the blind, and it puts people at health risk, including ourselves. And I speak that from the inside. I did it for years. I don't recommend it. Knowledge is better. Vidya is better.
And also, Robin, in terms of other healthcare professionals, physical therapies, speech language pathology, myofunctional therapists.
Absolutely, and also dental hygienists, people who are working, and I've had several of those approach me, and they're very interested in this. It's starting to become more known in the world of orthodontia,
dentistry and sleep.
Hazards of mouth breathing, the effect on the acidity of the system, and so this is becoming. It feels like a tipping point in a variety of areas.
It does. I would agree. Breathing.
More notice.
Breathing has really changed. You know, when 2002, not so many people knew about breathing to kind of from what we were doing. And I've noticed it since 2015 that it's really the awareness. I would say the two topics are hot at the moment, breathing and sleep, and we can impact both of them. So it's a nice time, you know, that we're kind of riding that wave, which is tremendous. And I think it's only going to grow. So we'll end it at this, and look forward to seeing and reading your new book, Restoring Prana. It can be bought from Amazon anyway straight away. I'm sure it'll be available in some bookstores, but definitely Amazon, if you put Restoring Prana in it and Robin Rothenberg, you'll be able to see the reference there to buy it pre-order. And enjoy. I think it'll be your time will be well spent. Take care.
Thank you.